You went in for one pot hose. You came home with a fiddle leaf fig, a bag of propagation clippings a stranger handed you at a yard sale, and a story about how the guy at the nursery just seemed like he knew what he was talking about. There's a shelf in your garage now. Mason jars. Old pickle jars, the label soaked off. Each one holding a cutting you rescued from somewhere, a coworker's dying office plant nobody else wanted, a broken stem you found on the sidewalk and couldn't leave there, something you weren't ready to let die. And there's the one in the hallway with terrible light. You know it's the wrong spot. You've known for 2 years. You keep it there anyway, because it was your dad's, or your ex-wife's, or the first thing you ever managed to keep alive without killing it in a month. When your kids call it Dad's jungle, you laugh it off. You change the subject. You don't really have the words for why it matters this much. It isn't a midlife crisis hobby. It isn't about decorating the man cave. There's a specific psychology behind why men your age are suddenly doing this, and it isn't what you've assumed. Here's what nobody talks about. You spent 30 years being told, directly or not, that your job was to provide, protect, and stay useful. Nobody handed you a job description for nurturing something small and keeping it alive for no reason at all except that you wanted to. So when that instinct shows up in your 40s and 50s, it doesn't feel like a hobby you picked up. It feels like something you discovered was already in you. 3 things are happening underneath that shelf of jars, and none of them are really about plants. First, a body and a role that spent decades being useful is finally being allowed to be gentle instead. Second, a house that used to be loud, cleats by the door, homework at the kitchen table, someone always needing something, got quiet, and something in you needed to fill that quiet with something that grows instead of something that just sits there. Third, a kind of control you lost somewhere else in your life, a marriage, a job, a version of yourself you used to recognize, is quietly being rebuilt, 3 inches at a time on a windowsill. This isn't just a feeling you're having. There's real research behind why this specific behavior shows up in men at this specific age. Biologist Edward O. Wilson called it biophilia, the idea that humans have a deep evolved need to affiliate with living things, not as a luxury, but as something closer to a baseline requirement for feeling okay. Psychologists Rachel and Stephen Kaplan built on that with attention restoration theory, showing that tending something living is one of the few activities that actually lets an overworked, decision-fatigued mind recover, instead of just distracting itself with something else. And researcher Roger Ulrich ran a well-known hospital study that found patients recovering in rooms with a view of greenery healed faster and needed less pain medication than patients staring at a brick wall. The trend data backs up what you're seeing in your own garage too. Industry research from plant supplier Monrovia has tracked a specific rise in men in their late 30s through mid-40s getting into gardening since the pandemic, and unlike a lot of pandemic hobbies, actually staying with it years later. Not a spike. A pattern that held. You didn't stumble into this by accident. Your nervous system found something it was already built to need, and it just took 40-something years for the timing to line up. None of these researchers were talking about middle-aged men in suburban garages specifically. But that's exactly the point. The need is old and universal. It just spent most of your life buried under a job title, a mortgage, and a version of masculinity that had no line item for tend to something small. The shelf in your garage is where that buried need finally found an outlet nobody could argue with. Picture this. It's Saturday morning. The house is quiet in a way it never used to be. The kids are either still asleep upstairs or not living here anymore, and either way, nobody needs anything from you yet. You go down to the garage with a coffee before anyone else is awake. You check each one. You turn the pot on the windowsill a quarter turn so the leaves grow evenly instead of leaning toward the light. You missed the fern because you read somewhere that it likes the humidity. You crouch down and notice the new growth on the cutting you weren't sure would take, the one in the pickle jar, the one you almost threw out, and something in your chest loosens a little, just for a second, in a way you couldn't explain to anyone standing there. Nobody's watching. Nobody's grading this. There's no scoreboard, no performance review, no one asking what any of it is for. For 20 minutes, your only job is to notice something small, care for it, and watch it respond. That's it. That's the whole job. And it is the first job in a long time that has felt entirely, quietly yours, no deadline attached, no one else's approval required. Here's the part that actually explains why this hits different for men your age specifically. Most of the relationships you were taught to maintain came with rules attached. Checking in on a friend felt like it needed a reason, or it read as weird. A plant doesn't work that way. You water it, it grows. You forget, it wilts, and you can see exactly what you did wrong, and you fix it, and it forgives you completely and instantly. There's no argument about it later.
No misreaton.
No conversation you were supposed to have that you kept putting off until it turned into something bigger. It's the same instinct underneath both. The instinct to notice something, to care for it, to keep it alive, but with all the risk of getting it wrong with an actual person stripped clean out of it. That's not a lesser version of connection. It's closer to a rehearsal space, a low-stakes place to practice a muscle a lot of men your age were never really given permission to use out loud in the first place. Compare it to what nurturing usually cost you growing up. If you showed too much of it at the wrong moment, it got read as soft, or as trying too hard, or as not quite masculine enough. So you learned to route that instinct into things that were safer to care about out loud. A car, a lawn, a grill, a garage full of tools nobody else was allowed to touch. The plants are just the newest version of that same old workaround, except this time the thing you're caring for is actually alive, and it's actually responding to you, and that changes what the caring does to you on the inside. Let's be honest, though. Not every jar on that shelf is about restoration. For some men, especially after a divorce, or after the kids move out and the house goes silent in a way that isn't peaceful, it's just empty. The plants aren't a rehearsal space for something bigger. They're the whole performance. Therapists who work with men going through a later-in-life divorce point to something specific. Men often don't have a built-in support system the way women more often do. No standing group text, no circle of friends who check in unprompted just because it's Tuesday. So the plant on the windowsill becomes the one relationship in the house that reliably responds to effort. That's not weird, and it's not pathetic. But it's worth naming, because pretending every jar on that shelf is pure joy would be its own kind of dishonesty, and some of you already know exactly which jar this is about. Sometimes a windowsill full of green is recovery. Sometimes it's the only thing left in the house still asking to be needed. So think back to that shelf in the garage. The pickle jars. The plant in the wrong light that you keep anyway, year after year. You aren't overcompensating for something you can't name out loud. You aren't hiding from your life behind a hobby that's easier than the real conversations. You aren't, despite what the jokes at dinner might suggest, a little bit ridiculous for caring this much about a fern that cost $12. You are a man who spent decades being told his job was to provide and stay steady, who finally found something that lets him be gentle without having to explain why to anyone. You are someone whose nervous system, quietly and correctly, identified exactly what it was missing. Softness, quiet, something small that responds to being noticed, and went and found it 3 inches at a time, in a mason jar on a garage shelf nobody else pays attention to. That's not a midlife crisis your family is politely tolerating. That's not a phase you'll grow out of. That's a need finally getting met, after waiting a very long time in line behind everyone else's. So tell me in the comments, what's the one plant on your shelf you can't fully explain to anyone else? The cutting you weren't supposed to save, or the moment in that quiet garage when you realized you weren't just growing plants, you were growing something back into yourself.